Hello everyone, today we talk about Tamerlane and a bit of his historical context, as we sometimes concentrate too much maybe on the figure, on the biography and so on, the character and so on, but it's important also to understand relatively to, especially to the videos that we've done recently about the Mongol expansion and empire and so on, what the meaning of this all was, right? What on which wake a figure like Timur stood, and also what legacy he left, and else, because Tamerlane Empire and the Timurid dynasty weren't just the only powers that existed out there. Every once in a while we cover, let's say, mostly the military organization of these Central Asian peoples, and we measure not only their important military capacity, but also how they their political and social structures kind of overlap often with each other, and how they intersect in other times. They simply informed, in fact, that kind of strategic culture and political symbology, because this is what also Timur fundamentally embodied: the continuation of the Kingizid power. In a way or another, there is a debate whether he was actually related to the Kingizid dynasty. Well, he claimed to have a common ancestor together with Genghis Khan, relatively to his mother. Nobody really knows, but she may have actually descended from Genghis Khan himself. But this biological element is not even that important as much as the fact is the symbolical legacy that Timur was taking on himself. So let's look a bit, first of all, of the context where he rose power, because also about Timur, that has a dimension that is often overlooked, or at least people start reading about his life, but saying, okay, wait a minute. Yes, we more or less have an idea geographically of where this thing is taking place. In fact, but what about politically? Like, what was the situation at the time, right? And it's important to start from the successor states of the Mongol Empire. So, as we've seen also in the last videos, the Ilk Khanate and the Khanate of the Golden Horde had Islamicized, right, by the 14th century, in part because of the absorption of the ruling class in the local culture, but also because probably of the contraction and fragmentation of universal power. Also, in a sense, the end of the great phase of expansion that had up to that point kind of oriented the Mongols also towards a broader horizon, where not just Islam from the western part was concerned, also Christianity. You see even in there the contraction of European capacity, and the end of the Crusades had brought to some consequences in relatively to the possible open to Christianity. In China, Buddhism and Taoism had fundamentally been the mix, and so the same empire had, and the same Islam, by the way, also with terrible blow that it had received from the Mongol conquests, had contracted, had transformed also in many ways, at least, especially in the Middle East, in something more hybrid. In fact, the same Mongol culture. Still, there is in here the dialectic between the Turkic world and the Arab world, and so on. Speaking of the Golden Horde, especially, this power had Islamicized and gradually affirmed its hegemony on southern Russia, right? And that would remain essentially the center of its power, and up to essentially Kazakhstan, the region that stretches from the Urals to western Siberia, fundamentally. So a very wide area, right? Because in the east it arrived as far as sometimes, there wasn't really a boundary in between, and no major power up to Mongolia and China, you can argue. So you can imagine even the degree of, it would be very interesting to study about what was kind of the administration. Like, mostly it was just, this tribes settled there, maintaining loose political contact with the center. The Golden Horde, as we know, had rendered vassals the same Russian princes of Moscow, and the most interesting political military dialectic, let's say, between the Golden Horde was with Russia, in fact, and these other powers rise in Central Asia, including the Timurid Empire. Speaking of the Ilkhanate, instead, this Khanate began to lose force. This was a process maybe connected more to the feudal nature of Persia itself. It wasn't really the steppe. As you know, the northern part had always been kind of open to the settlement of new steppe peoples. The south was more civilized and influenced by the great Mesopotamian culture that had received a dramatic blow, especially with the Mongol destruction of Baghdad and all these things. But let's say Persia is a very complex thing and also difficult to control properly from a unitary point of view, whereas the steppe is, yes, in a sense, it, as we've seen, has more floating boundaries, but for especially fully nomadic realities, or at least with some that are largely nomadic realities with some centers that don't think about Sarai on the Volga as the capital, but still it's there is there's no much of an obstacle in between in order to stretch, at least extensionally, the domination. And of the collapse of the Ilkhanate profited immediately Arab, Turkish, Persian, and Georgian princes that were settled at their boundaries. So from essentially the Persian Gulf to Anatolia to Caucasus. So all tough areas, right, where no major power fundamentally had developed just by you could argue the nature of the places, how they had remained relatively peripheral at some point historically. And a similar process of disgregation was known by the Chagatai Khanate, right? This Central Asian power, essentially stretching from the Oxus River, so today's Syr-Darja, and Mongolia. And within this, the Chagatai Khanate was essentially split into two macro areas, let's say. From one side, that corresponded to important cultural differences. The eastern part that was more Mongol in nature, right? They were more favorable to the traditional culture in general, the one of the steppes, right? It was also proper nomadic lifestyle. In a western one was more Islamicized, and albeit and kind of closer to civilization, you can argue from that side of from the western side, but also not oblivious of the originary Mongol culture. So the area was also quite, Turkic in character, aside from these external influences, and ethnicities there had always kind of blended dramatically, also previously in the European time. So it's a very interesting melange. And to the latter part, the western part, belonged the village of Hayi-Ilgar, depending on the city of Kesh, that is today's Shahr-i-Sabz, that is the Green City, located some 80 kilometers south of Samarkand. And here, in 1336, Timur, which means iron in Turkic, was born, right? And so he is better known, in fact, as Tamerlane in the West. And his parents belonged to those nomadic groups that were settled in Central Asia after these waves of invasions, but also simply transhumances that had variously happened throughout the centuries. Because in the steppe, you're where or not are always on the move, right? We've seen this western part was kind of was closer to sedentary areas, right? Even the existence of cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and so on. This had been the northeasternmost boundary of Islamic, you can argue, Romano-Hellenistic civilization that had somewhat also settled or revived the urban culture this city is founded sometimes at the time of Alexander in the area. So these were interesting places that were also Islamic culture had drawn a lot of its own, of its, especially mostly Persian culture, but still in these frontier areas with the steppes, some of its finest thinkers in the high and the low Middle Ages, because it was a very cross-cultural area, so it received a dramatic amount of influxes from China, from the steppe, from Islamic culture, from, say, Arab culture, Persian culture, and also connected with, even far away with Europe and so on, because these were naturally also the areas where the Silk Route passed more consistently in the continental side. And this kind of bastard nature, right, of the population that is settled there, would make the tribes, such as the one which Timur was born, known as the Karaunas, which in fact it's a contemporary term that means half blood, right? So stressing in that context that in the steppes it's really important. It's almost paradoxical. The idea that at that point, in spite of how always blended steppes had been, the Mongol culture, identity, legacy was seen as the gold standard, right? The Mongols had been the Khans of Khans, the oceanic universal rulers, right, of the world. So, in a sense, all the other peoples had mostly derived their power from them. This is something that the Saint Timur would use, for example, in Anatolia to claim, his suzerainty. As we'll see, it was mostly founded on a Mongol base, at least for this broader universal sense, on the Seljuk rule of Anatolia. And, even the Ottomans still, importantly, at a very important moment of their power, that they still were quite obsequious, albeit rendering them their own vassals, to entities like the Khanate of Crimea, or in the same Golden Horde, because they still tributed as heavily westernized Turks, right? It were basically more Europeans than Turks, frankly, from an ethnic point of view. Even today's Turks do not really look like Central Asians, right? And so would tribute a manifest fact, reverence to the Khanate, to the idea that, of course, there was something in common between the Turks and the Mongols, right? We mostly distinguish them as families. Of course, they have different language and so on, but in a way, they had been importantly blended in this process, and still they shared some cultural models. And so this thing had been that big. This is something I was talking about the Mongol Empire and its legacy and so on. It's something that in the West we have properly not absorbed, because we've never kind of bought into that side, right? Because in part was properly the other side, or at least we perceived it as such, the same Ottomans, etc. So, but that was the extraordinary impact that it's the single most important thing that the steppes had ever known. There is no doubt about that. And so it was very important to stress at that point, even basically in a racist fashion, or quasi-racist, the idea that, if you're not really of Mongol descent, of Mongol blood, for whatever it could mean in that mess of the steppe, and you can imagine, what was the trackability of genealogies and all these things, and how many, children the Khans had spread all over the steppes, literally, because polygamy was a prerogative of theirs. Doesn't even make sense, but culturally speaking, it was very important, because there were some models that you were inspired or not inspired to. In fact, you can argue that surely there was some kind of ethnic, pre-Mongol, spirit, feeling, burning under the ashes, right? And so, of what had come before. And so this was just a political tool to say, okay, was the ruling. It's a bit like in the West. It's there are ruling model identity, and so it's like Christianity and paganism, right? And how politically and socially that happened. As aristocrats, you didn't like kings that were trying to Christianize, to centralize. As soon as you became king, you became Christian yourself and started going against it. It's the same old story, right? It's all an hypocrisy. But it's still necessary to kind of distinguish who's who in terms of who's ruling, who's contesting that, and so on. And this was all mixed. Just think about with Islam, that the Mongols originally had nothing to do with. So that just think about the blend there that had occurred, and all the symbolisms and the let's say the meanings that you could, let's say, play with, right, to appeal yourself to say, okay, and to create something innovative, as fundamentally the Timurid Empire was in this regard, because it wasn't quite truly Mongol, it wasn't quite truly Turkic, it wasn't quite truly Persian, right? It was, yes, mostly based on Persia, as a matter of fact, as the main regional power, but fundamentally not only, and also the models probably changed according to whom you had to show them, in a sense. But surely in a hierarchy, the Mongol one was more important. Now, Timur's father, Taragai, was, however, a powerful chieftain of the Ulus of the Barlas, that were actual Mongols, approximately. They were Muslim, but however, in culture, they were heavily Turkicized, right? And so, again, this is mostly a cultural thing. We don't even know ethnically what we're talking about. As far as we know, Timur might have, even some traditions say even that he had red hair, like, he could have been easily somebody of even older descent of some kind of, the European element that had remained, of course, since in the millennia, in the steppes and so on. But again, it's a matter of political motive. So about that aspect, we don't really care more than much. And also, it's a word of legend by a certain degree, right? These are not what you would really call as civilized places, right? So even the way we make history with them is mostly based on a kind of a mythology that was eventually developed later on. In any case, the Barlas as Karaunas were not particularly privileged, right? But this made them arguably more hungry and so entrepreneurial in a sense. And so the area, as we've seen, was politically unstable. The older Chagatai system was disgregating. And so this is where Timur was molded properly as the extraordinary conqueror, military commander that he proved to be. So the local clans were weak. The various Mongol groups were constantly fighting one against the other. And so through his military policy by 1369, Timur found himself to be the sole ruler of Transoxiana. It's a quite important region, also because of as we've seen, the cities, the Silk Route, and so on. And the following year, he assumed the title of Emir, which is interesting. And he associated that with the title Great, meaning that, a bit like the Khans of Khans, he was the Emir of Emirs. So that is, in that case, specifically the head, right, of all the princes of Transoxiana. Now, Emir, as you know, however, is an Arab word, which intended in this case to underline his Islamic pietas. This is yet another interesting aspect, because he injected that as not just a religious thing, but also as a cultural thing in the moment he chose an Arab word for expressing that. And so that shows also what, that degree of local, tone that surely the Mongols had not had in a full sense, at least according to this vocabulary. And in the meanwhile, Timur had married descendant of the same Genghis Khan, the princess Sarai Malik Khatun, which was a big deal in the sense because his children eventually would have been descending from Genghis Khan. He was, in the sense, all one with the system, and that conferred him the right, in fact, to boast the title of Kürgen, that in the Mongol Empire had designated the imperial son-in-law, right? So those chieftains that married essentially the great Khan's daughters. Now, according to the new course, impressed by his ambitions that led him ever more far away from the original nomadic traditions of the Turco-Mongol tribes, Timur decided to settle also in a true and proper capital. This is yet another important cultural choice that drives, in part, you understand here, it's both, it's taking a bit all the political benefits of the various cultures that he shared in a way. So in this case, settling in a capital, which, according to at least the most Mongolic and also in part the Turkic tradition, was not really, the most important thing you can imagine. This naturally was also necessary for having a center, a base, a capital who could control so the administration of the ever larger territories that he was subduing. And so he chose Samarkand. The city was famous because Alexander the Great had journeyed there. In medieval Islam, everybody was radically obsessed with Alexander the Great, way more than in Christian Europe. And that was, Samarkand herself, not important just because Alexander from this city had somewhat, centered that, eventually also in his legacy, that Hellenic Bactrian culture, in which had been achieved the meeting between the Hellenic and the Indian world historically. So that was actually a very important political and strategic, project to unveil, even just by choosing such important center. For not talking about also the much more concrete fact, in at least at the moment, that Samarkand was the most important market located across the Silk Route. So both Tamerlane and his immediate successors would have made of this region, that is roughly today's Uzbekistan, one, let's say, of the artistic and scientific centers of beauty and importance. So much that still today, much of the local art, and that dates some of the most beautiful buildings, architecture dates fundamentally to the Timurid era, as a testament to the fact that that was the center of the empire. So all the loot and the wealth accumulated in this systematic subjugation and extermination, seemingly brought to the death of up to 17 million people, was condensed in this area. So where that capitalized upon the wealth and started erecting this magnificent structures in an area that otherwise would have probably not had the same things if it hadn't been for that historical conjuncture, right? And Tamerlane began furthermore to provide his empire of institutions, right? So he had pretty clear in mind that the nomadic way was not the only one, right? He wanted to stabilize an empire and set, a dynasty, a legacy that would live on. But from his standpoint, that, as we've seen, was not also one of the most, clamorous or relevant, that this orientation toward the sedentary world and its institutional administrative structures was quite important, and he was right. Here it's the blend is fascinating because he formalized the summoning of periodical kurultai. So basically, what were the traditional councils in Karakorum in the Mongolian tradition, that in this sense, as a Mongol legacy, would have had to provide legitimacy to his rule. And what was the symbol here? Because Timur government was fundamentally despotic. It was based also quite, I would say unavoidably, considering the premises of those politics and structures on systematic subjugation and terror, destruction. This had already been a deal of the Mongols, but that's kind of obvious. How can you keep this system together from a barely stabilized reality stretching across thousands of kilometers if you don't use a terroristic strategy in order to say to make any subject thinking, okay, let's not do anything strange, otherwise we will our heads will end up in those towers that the Timurids were famous to building of towers literally built out of human skulls. Seward had the Timurids had a passion literally for this beheading, and they, again, some of the greatest massacres. This is nothing to envy to the Mongols, right? And they continued followed up the legacy pretty faithfully, let's say. But the idea of the Kurultai was kind of a more democratic one, at least in the sense of the idea of it's like the concept of the great emir that he had created. I mean, a sort of primus inter pares, right? That's the same thing that Genghis Khan had done with the Mongols. He had given us kind of a national unity by stressing the fact that, yes, the great Khan was fundamentally elected, right? And in the best of tribal traditions, even in there, fundamentally was a despotic government, and that all the newly conquered territories would be essentially part of the imperial ulus, so a sort of personal property of the imperial family. Whereas, however, the various tribes of Mongolia would dwell free in their homeland and just fundamentally profiting of the shares that their joint effort under the great Khan of this transcontinental conquest would bring. So basically, Timur was at war in his life for 35 years. Again, there was not really much that a Turkic Mongol leader could even think of doing different. Like, first of all, if you hadn't done that, you would have simply died beforehand. Because aside from the, of course, was not just about literally wiping from the face of the earth everybody, but it still, if you wanted to defend your ulus, your assets, there was no other way. And secondly, in order to keep this more extended dominion intact, you had to be always on the march, right? And in fact, there is much about the Timurid armies that continued in the wake of the best Mongol strategic culture, covering these thousands of kilometers all in a row with the means of the time, with the logistics that these nomadic peoples were properly expert on, and striking fear and clamorous victories, in fact, in all around, right? And in fact, campaigning in the most diverse areas, from Russia to India, from China to Anatolia. So it was a very big and extended power that, however, as such, had to to be held up on spirited, because otherwise would have simply fallen apart. And that's, at the end of the day, what these powers did after a while, right? Either they continued on, again, a pre-existing regional base, as it could be Persia, or there was no much. In fact, much of the Timurid legacy was connected to that. And this is interesting. Actually, we made a video on the Timurid army organization, and we've seen how important the local militias, aside from the nomadic tribesmen, were crucial also to provide that engineering, culture, the technical support that, a country like Persia and the Islamic world broad demand had quite more than the steppe, that had drawn systematically from this also, as you know, the Mongols from China and so on. And there was surely a transformation of this, and what we see in all these powers is that they the wildest, the most pressured, kind of had this moral strength to expand this dominions all of a sudden, like in the case of Timur, and then they got what they wanted, because the nomadic shepherd wants just to get the, you know, the loot and finally the best pastures and settling down. And so they kind of soften up, they gentrify, they kind of, you know, these lands are better than the others because they are already populated by someone else that has not been able to defend them, but it still has kind of greater cultural influence, and so eventually absorbs you, and so you lazy up. And then there is yet another conqueror from the wilder area that comes, and basically this is the history of Central Asia in a nutshell, right? And so, but surely Timur's power was not the idea of the great emir elected by the other princes, right? It was just more like, again, an extremely brutal form of governance. That was exemplified in this 35 years of overwhelming as ruthless military campaigns in all directions. At the beginning of the 15th century, Timur's empire touched the Caucasus. It included the southern and central Caspian Sea. From the other side there was the Golden Horde, with whom he was also pretty a rival. I mean, initially they cooperated also against the Russians. Moscow was basically set on fire because of these connections by, if I'm not wrong, 1385 or 89, I don't remember. But still, they didn't quite like each other. Eventually, Timur crushed the Golden Horde camp into consecutive battles. We're talking about large spaces, so it's not just about, you know, they couldn't quite strike in the heart of their dominations, but they could, let's say, ruin the ruler's prestige and authority and deterrent capacity, that on the base of which, again, through terror, most of these territories could be realistically kept together by, you know, striking in one region, then in another, and kind of making the local populations rebel or passing from your side, preferably. His empire had also touched the Aral Lake, or sea if you prefer, all the area of the Syr-Darja and the Indus Valley, right? You know, Timur sacked Delhi. He sacked Baghdad. He sacked, you know, a lot of large cities, as we were saying before. We don't know how precisely how many people died altogether in the Timurid expansion, but we're talking about in the range of the tens of millions, which is some point percentage the population of the world by that time. So among the Mediterranean powers that could somewhat resist at the limits of this boundaries, in fact, was arguably only the Ottoman one. I mean, the Mamluks also had been defeated in Syria, so they had not been destroyed, but at least they hadn't opposed in a consistent fashion, or at least they had failed. Now, the Ottomans were at this point already rising importantly. They had already more possessions in Europe than in Asia. They were the rising power that was still doing so relatively slowly. The Westerners had somewhat underestimated its capacity. By that point, it was also kind of understandable. And what Timur thought, well, is, however, it wasn't much about what he thought about the beyond, but rather how far he could extend his own control, because, weakening the Mamluk state would mean to give also Anatolia a greater important dimension. The end of the Silk Route in the branch entered the Mediterranean, so it was important to extend control in that part. And yet again, as we have seen in that recent video about the, let's say, European-Mongol relations historically, when the Timurids attacked the Ottomans, well, the Westerners, however, thought well that this was a good thing for them, and so that the interests of Europe and of the Khan of Samarkand would fundamentally overlap. So this idea that there had been the Mongols out there, we've talked about this, the Mongol in Asia somewhere at this point. There wasn't more contact there had been between Europe and the East in the 13th century, but that could in theory ally themselves with the Christians, if not really maybe converting, but still, however, attacking other Muslims. Well, it was an idea. Still, Columbus thought to find to arrive in Asia from the east, from an Asian perspective, and finding still a Mongol Khan there, and by the end of the 15th century, and that's where the Europeans by default now were thinking these pretty convulsed waves of mass and things that were happening in Central Asia. Because they kind of knew, they heard of the story that independently from how much they could grasp concretely. As soon as there was an opportunity that was more evidently at hand, they would invest in intelligence and information. So, indeed, Timur was appearing as a similar thing to the overwhelming Mongol wave of 150 years before to the Europeans, and with such memory, Christendom was again infused with the possibility of an alliance with the steppe peoples in order to defeat not much Islam altogether, because at that point Europeans were not even interested in that kind of, at least they had other things they were thinking about, and the same reason why they didn't intervene with all the the decisiveness in curbing the Ottoman expansion, which was something that could actually be done, right? There is nothing deterministic, or the Ottomans didn't have any magic power. They simply earned the thing, also because the Westerners not just either let them do, but they were even interested at some point to let them do. I mean, as we'll see now, after the defeat of Ankara in the 12 years of Ottoman civil war, it was fundamentally the Hospitaliers and the Venetians that allowed the Ottomans to reunite, and at that point it would have simply been possible to break them. So all the story that Constantinople had to fall, it's all it's not there's no determinism in it. Historiographically, nobody believes this anymore. Naturally, Europe had much secularized from the time, so it was much more pragmatic and also realistic assessment about this thing. They were interested at that point in crushing the Ottomans, throwing the whole Anatolian region in kind of turmoil. And so, in a sense, I don't know how consistently one could say that in the Ural-Altai world the Ottomans could represent, I won't say a threat, but at least a competitor to Timurid power. So that the same thing could have been said about the Mamluks, albeit they were mostly a Egyptian-based power, but still pretty Levantine in that sense, pretty close to the Near and controlling the same Near East more than the Ottomans did. The Mamluks in that instance had been humiliated, so in a sense also reversing the success that the Mamluks had originally scored against the Mongol invasion of Egypt back in the day. So maybe that was settled, but the important here was literally stressing how any other power was kind of nothing to him. Right? If you read even the diplomatic exchange between between Timur and the Ottoman Sultan, properly, he says you're an ant, right? Don't go against elephants because you will be crushed, right? And so you actually what happened at Ankara in 1402. We'll see it in a while. I mean, Timur assessment was probably right. I mean, maybe not literally, because it was still a hardly fought battle, but still, especially considering the outstretched logistical capacities of the Tatars, that was a striking victory over the Turks. There were broader interests from a European side. It is interesting because you may wonder, but how did actually, studying Tamerlane history is relevant for a European? Well, because European merchants at the times, for example, aside from the things that could happen and did happen, or the things that didn't happen, but still, European merchants hoped, again, in a new Pax Mongolica that would have reopened and rendered fast and safe the caravan routes that from the Black Sea and Armenia passing through Persia led to East Asia. Europe remembered that this had been possible and that people had traveled very fast and also in consistent numbers to China and so on. And so there was already at this point like kind of an exploring seed present in among the Europeans at this point. They were mostly taking the Atlantic route and so on. And powers like the Ottoman one were surely a problem for those who wanted to reach undisturbed the East like before, chiefly thinking about Venice and so on. Now, the Byzantine prince John Palaiologos, that the Basileus Manuel, leaving for Europe in search of help against the Ottomans, had left in Constantinople as a regent, made an agreement with the Genoese podesta of the Galata in order to establish contacts with the Khan. And Constantinople at this point was already obliged to pay a regular tribute to the Sultan Bayezid that obviously was a yoke essentially on the Byzantine Empire from the Ottomans that John wanted surely to break, thanks to the help of Timur. And that would have probably actually required the same tribute, but at least would have tried to exact it from a greater distance, so that Constantinople would have been more decentralized in that sense. So actually the nature of the agreement contemplated exactly this. They told him, like, look, we will give you the same tribute that we owe to Bayezid if you attack and destroy him. And the same Timur naturally was interested in that, because he would have been the main, together with the Westerners, they would have both won of the final securitization. I don't know how to say this, of the ports, the Levantine ports of the Silk Route that would have been organized mostly by the Italians again, but still, paying tolls to Timur. The Ottomans standing in between were not really a good idea, nor the Mamluks for that matter. And the proof that such perspective was consistent is the fact that even a power like France was still interested in the agreement. That later on, France at this point was still, the 100 Years' War was still going on and so on. Later on, France and the Ottomans would ally themselves in this bigger international game. But by this point, France still was actually quite interested in the possibility of still taking Constantinople, of resuming those crusading policy, ideally, or at least, given the role that it had in the last, during the Crusades altogether, but properly with dreams of an hegemonic capacity, recovering the title of Latin emperors and of kings of Jerusalem and so on. And so the King of France provided some Dominican missionaries, considering that the Dominican order had traditionally good relations with the Mongols. because they had already been sent, as we've seen in other videos, as ambassadors to them, and also a good knowledge of Armenia and Persia as well. It's a bit of the Mashraq in general, and so areas that were, especially Persia, central to the Timurid Empire. So those would make a good work of, intercultural dialogue, proposing, in fact, to the same Timur, a French alliance against a common alliance against the Ottomans. So Tamerlane was really preparing his troops to fight the Ottomans. He didn't let these proposals fall. He also hoped to obtain, through an alliance with Genoa and Venice, that naval support that he was devoid of, because it was an eminently terrestrial power. And at the end of July 1402, near Ankara, in the heart of Anatolia, Mongols and Ottomans clashed in a pretty big battle indeed, that we will make a video on at some point, hopefully, and defeated, let's say, in the Timur defeated the Ottomans. And however, this crushing victory was seen now as actually a tide reversal, in the sense that those who had rejoiced of the Timurid victories realized that the Timurid power was actually becoming an ever greater threat than the Ottomans, because as a master of Anatolia, Timur displayed no interest in accepting, comparticipants in his triumph. He claimed his descendancy from Genghis Khan, of which he proclaimed himself to be the heir, and pretended to be wanting to restore the empire, overthrowing in December 1402 from Smyrna the Hospitallers of Rhodes, and making a massacre there, by the way, and obliging the two cities that had both the name of Phocea, fundamentally, and Chios, that were located on the Anatolian coast and important for the production of alum, right? Those were areas where the Genoese had been heavily involved for the Byzantines, to render homage to him. So, quite prepotent attitude. However, in spite of this, Europeans realized that, yeah, he could claim all that, but that his base of power was much more distant than Anatolia. And, for example, a king like Henry III of Castile sent Timur more than a diplomatic mission. And indeed, Timur had other projects that basically had nothing to do with the West at that point, but actually with the diametrically opposed direction, because he began to fantasize about conquering the Chinese Empire altogether. And however, starting this enterprise that also alarmed the Chinese. I mean, the objective was attacking Ming China to restore the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols. So this idea now, the more ecumenic he got in power, the more Mongol he was, claiming to be politically, symbolically. And he usually preferred to campaign in spring, but that year he decided to campaign in winter, and yet he got sick. The Chinese kind of freaked out at some level. They reinforced this frontier strongholds and so on. But that year in 1405, Timur died. He got sick and died. And as a consequence, actually, his empire, his immense empire at that point, fragmented in powers that were just hostile among each other. After some, let's say, strife, 12 years of strife, the Ottomans um, actually recompacted and resumed their advance against Constantinople in Europe. So that's another story. We made videos about that, but let's say that was a moment in which the Ottomans still could be repressed. Instead, the Westerners didn't quite press further. Actually, they actually shipped the Ottomans back in safety when the Timurids had become too dangerous at that point. And in general, that was, especially at that point, considering that Ottoman power had been ruined, that it wasn't even predictable that the Ottomans would necessarily recover. And still, the Westerners thought they had control over that, and they did. Right? It's just that they lost it again because they wouldn't even consider that as a big deal. So it's not just because what happened later they should have thought better, because at the time you would not been better than them in holding the situation, understanding it, and politically or strategically foreseeing how things would have done, because it was always an extremely closely fought competition between everybody involved, right? It's not just focusing about the Ottomans, because they weren't, by that point, nothing particularly special compared to the others yet. So it's so you can argue that this was, in some ways, I mean, later on there were also other conquerors, there were other revivals. It was mostly Persia that reacquired some importance in this. Probably already the Timurid power proved this, that the Ilkhanate could be reinforced, at least from this area like Transoxiana and the western side of of the steppes. That was kind of the most obvious center of power, the regional base from which you could enact all these things. Where in fact the Saint Timurids had enacted, as we've seen, some kind of subtle administration, in spite of the important injection of nomadic culture that left a mark in Saint Persia. Speaking of Europe in general, how this impacts, let's say, it was mostly the Golden Horde to remain like a regular presence in the game. The Khanate of the Golden Horde, this comes from the Tatar Altin Ordu, which means literally Golden Dynasty, right? If you remember, had been founded by Batu Khan. He had established his capital in Sarai on the Volga River, and in the moment of his maximum apogee between the 13th and 14th century, the Khanate could count on territories that literally stretched from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea, right? Even in here, there were, mostly these were the extremes. There were it was a decentralized government. Most of these territories were also tributaries, simply, right? So that's how you count them. But still, the Golden Horde projection capabilities strategically could arrive to them, right? So Russia, as we've seen, was the most invested country by this. It was heavily Mongolized in culture. That's a moment of really a seminal moment in the creation of Russian political military culture, and by Golden Horde influence, so much that that Moscow, especially, that was rising in power from a modest, if not insignificant position compared to the other Russian cities, was kind of nurtured, began practically the referee of the Golden Horde in order to claim, to exact the tributes from the other Russian principalities, right? And in turn paying a tribute to the Golden Horde themselves, and suffering repeatedly also their military pressure, because they were always next door that could always retaliate if they were trying to kind of sneak out. Like, it was kind of normal in this sense. It was a pretty messed up situation. At some point we should come back on Mongol Russia as well, because it's it's actually very interesting. and it shows also this gradual, not just hybrid naturally between the two cultures, but also the gradual shift in power, right, in 2 centuries from, say, the Mongol domination to the Russian domination on the same Mongols, and Tamerlane was indirectly responsible for this because he had inflicted very heavy blows to the Golden Horde himself, as we were saying before, and this helped essentially the Russians during the 15th century to revive their power up to even the Great. I mean, up to that, essentially managed to crush the same Mongol domination and to transform the same Golden Horde in essentially a cluster of smaller khanates, right, in a politically fragmentary picture. And yeah, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.